What should have been a relaxing stroll along the beach turns into a terrifying chase, as the protagonist realizes they are being followed. Who is this mysterious man dogging their steps, and what power could be so compelling that even in the face of danger, the protagonist must not reveal their true destination? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 1: The beach. I was being followed. It had taken me a while to notice, but now that I knew it, there was no denying the sense of danger. I had been lazily walking along the sand, letting the ocean waves wash around my ankles. The ocean always seemed to calm me, and today I needed it more than usual. The crashing of the waves had no problem taking over my senses, and I had no problem letting them. Maybe that's why the man was practically on top of me before I even noticed him. Once I realized I was being followed, I managed to fall in pace with a group of teenagers walking my way. As I walked with them, I watched until the man fell further behind the group, clearly confused. When he was a safe enough distance, I ducked underneath one of the large boulders lining the beach. Since then I hadn't moved. I hadn't even peeked around the rock to see if he was close to my hiding spot. I didn't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I wasn't intent on finding out. The only problem was that I wasn't supposed to be here at the beach. I was supposed to be on my way back home so that I could beat my mother's husband before he got there. However, I'd gotten off work early today, and thought I'd chance a small walk along the shore. I told myself that I needed a clear brain. This week held countless things I needed to sort out, including how and when I was going to escape this place. Of course, this wasn't something I could talk about. If anyone found out what I was planning, I'd be punished for my crime. It wasn't exactly legal for a human to leave this town. The sun was starting its slow descent from the sky, and I knew my time on the beach should be ending. I took a deep breath, holding myself as still as possible as I peeked up from the black boulder. My eyes quickly darted each direction, watching for immediate signs of danger. When I saw none, I let my gaze scan the area slowly. After a few moments, I realized the man was nowhere in sight and I could chance an escape. I peeled myself away from the smooth surface and tiptoed through the sand, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. When I was fully out in the open, I started walking quickly. My senses were more aware now though, so I figured I'd know if the man was close. I was wrong. All at once, the man appeared once again in my vision. He was ahead of me this time, and it took all my self-control to calmly turn around and head back the other direction. It was opposite of where I needed to go, but it didn't matter. At this point, the only thing that mattered was not getting caught. Because of this, I had to force myself not to sprint in the other direction or draw attention to myself. I told myself that for all I knew he hadn't noticed me, and I would be able to slip away silently. Suddenly, a large hand was placed on my shoulder, just above my backpack. I whirled around, coming face to face with my stalker. He was taller than me, at least another 2 heads beyond mine. He was thick and muscular, his broad shoulders practically blocking my line of view. His beefy hands fully enveloped my shoulder, and I suddenly felt as if I was 5 years old again, looking at the face of someone that held much more power than I ever would. The grip on my shoulder released when I turned around, but I didn't stay put. I slowly started backing away, raising my palms towards my assailant while simultaneously looking for an escape route. "Who are you?" My voice came out barely above a whisper as I continued to try and create distance between me and the man. He stared at me, something stirring in his eyes at my voice. Whatever was there didn't settle right in my stomach, and I involuntarily froze. He noticed this and proceeded to close the distance between us, reaching again for my shoulder. It only took a second for my mind to register this. When it did, I spun around and started to sprint. However, the moment I did was the moment I realized he backed me into the same boulder I had been hiding in just moments ago. I ran straight into the rocks, turning around quickly when I realized I was trapped. When I came face to face with the man again, I reached for my backpack. I quickly unclipped my pepper spray and pressed down, letting the burning liquid reach my attacker's face. I waited for him to recoil so I could break away, but he didn't move. In fact, all he did was bring his shirt up to his face and wipe off the oozing liquid. I stared in disbelief, glancing between him and my spray. Then it hit me. Pepper spray worked on humans. "No," I whispered, looking at the man's face, horrified. My resolve was gone and replaced with complete and utter fear. He suddenly reached forward and grabbed the pepper spray from my hand. He tossed it to the side and brought his hands to his eyes, rubbing them with his palms. I watched my spray bounce off some rocks before disappearing into a tide pool, my hope following suit. Really? He finally spoke. His voice was masculine but not too deep. I expected it to be rough and demanding, but it was surprisingly lighthearted. Through his words he continued trying to rub the liquid out of his eyes. I waited for him to say more, unable to move from my position against the rock. My body itched to run. Panic crept into my chest when I peeked around his shoulders and realized how far away we were from everyone else. My heart started beating faster as I looked back to what was standing in front of me. Now that I had a clear view of him, I cursed myself. I should have known what he was. If I had been paying attention, I could have left the moment I noticed him. Finally, he sighed and brought his hands down to his side. He looked at me, dark eyes red and puffy but clearly healing. Was that really necessary? I raised my eyebrows but didn't voice my thoughts. I knew he could easily rip me in half. Honestly, after I pepper sprayed him, it was a miracle I wasn't dead already. In the end, I mumbled a quick and simple apology. I bent my head low, avoiding his gaze while praying he'd take pity on me. Thoughts raced through my mind as I waited for him to respond. I fought to understand why this creature singled me out, why he decided to follow me. I knew the only time someone like him spoke to someone like me was when they wanted something or someone. My breath hitched in my throat. The last thought struck me as I realized the only reasonable explanation. Somehow they had figured out I was leaving and he was here to finish me off before I could step a foot outside of this territory. He brought his hand up and I flinched, waiting for him to pin me down and finish me off. But his hand went to the back of his neck, where he rubbed it absent-mindedly. No, it's my bad. I shouldn't have followed you like this. Abruptly, he turned and started walking away, although it was more of a trudge than walk. I stood still for a moment watching him incredulously. Only when his figure disappeared into the crowd did I dare to let out a breath. My heart was still pounding, and I absently brought a hand to rest on it. I stood there, still as the rocks, for a good minute. Only when I once again noticed the setting sun did I start walking. My hand didn't leave my heart, and I doubted it ever would. My body knew how close it had come to danger, and was refusing to accept that I was safe. Walking away from a situation like that was unheard of. A werewolf wasn't keen on letting its prey escape. Werewolf. The word reverberated through my brain with each step I took. I had nothing but disdain and a sour taste in my mouth for them. The species. The tyrants. The murderers. Of course I could never let that show. The wolves had come out to us humans years ago when I was barely a child. From the stories I'd been told, I knew it was a gruesome and blood-filled time. But they had won, and now humans were at the bottom of a very long food chain. Some of the world still fought them, fought this new way of life, but they were nowhere to be found in this small town. This was exactly one of the reasons I planned on leaving. My feet sunk into the sand beneath me as I quickly made my way away from the cliffs. I had just reached the first of many beach umbrellas when I heard someone hollering behind me. I whirled around only to come face to face with the same man as before, though now I knew better than to call him a man. I stopped dead in my tracks, fear taking control of my limbs as I stared at his advancing frame. He ran until he was in front of me, then hesitated before he spoke. Hi, he trailed off. What? My confusion found its way into my mouth. I clamped my hand over it as soon as the word came out. You didn't question them. I'm sorry about earlier. You just took me off guard. His frame was starting to relax, but mine was doing the opposite. He looked into my eyes, waiting for me to answer. I hesitated before responding, voice trembling. It's fine. My statement came out as a question. The thing in front of me half smiled. It's all right, you don't have to be afraid of me. He reached out his hand and I jumped back. Once my feet started moving, they didn't stop. I was suddenly sprinting off the beach, very aware of the accusatory stares shot my direction. This wolf and I were disturbing the supposed peace. I heard him struggling in the sand behind me, trying to catch up. I only ran faster. I knew I shouldn't have turned my back on him, but there was no going back now. If I stopped, he'd tear me to shreds. Wait, he called just as my foot hit the wooden steps that led up to the pavement. I didn't stop at his words, but that didn't deter him. Before I could finish making it up the stairs, my wrist was caught in his hand, and he was holding me hostage. I whirled around to face him, only barely holding back a scream. Okay, this is going seriously wrong, he panted. His words were rushed, stressed. All I could do was stare at him and wait for my fate. However, the minute I thought he would kill me, he took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the action. What's your name? What? I cried out, thoroughly confused. I was pulling against his grip, but he didn't seem to notice. He raised one of his eyebrows and repeated his question. What's your name? Why do you want to know my name? He took another deep breath and loosened his grip on my wrist, ultimately letting it go. However, when I tried to sprint away, he grabbed it once again. I watched in horror as varying emotions filled his face, most of them being rage. I flinched violently when his free hand suddenly raised to the sky before resting on the back of his head. I can't believe this is really happening, he muttered. He looked at me, then to the sky, grumbling something else unintelligible. I held my breath as he spoke, not daring to move an inch. He either didn't notice my reaction or didn't care. Look, I'm sorry and I don't mean to scare you, and I know this is abrupt. He hesitated again, trailing off. His arm fell to his neck, where he continued to rest it. His frame seemed to be relaxed and stressed at the same time, only adding to my confusion. Can I just leave? My own voice met my ears, surprising me. He met my surprise for a minute, before letting his eyes darken. No. Why? I was on the verge of a panic attack. Because he trailed off, trying to find words. You just can't, okay? I didn't dare ask another question as his eyes seemed to fight varying colors. They turned from a deep obsidian blue to bright red too many times to count, his face contorting each time they did. I took this time to study his features, noticing he looked like many of the rest of his kind. His jaw was wide set with a matching nose, short hair accentuating the strong bones. He had tan skin that made him look as if he never left the sun. He noticed my gaze and I quickly looked away, fearing I'd angered him. He looked around at the people around us, opening and closing his mouth a few times. You're human, right? My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't want to answer that question even though he knew the answer. When he saw I was too terrified to speak, he continued. "'Kay, of course you are. Dumb question. I've just never seen you around before." I could have told him the reason for me and my family's distance, but once again I couldn't speak. The man breathed heavily through his mouth, letting his cheeks fill with air before he voiced his next question. Well, have you ever heard of mates? Chapter 2. The beach continued. Well, have you ever heard of mates? The word rang through my ears and my jaw dropped. I stared into his eyes, trying to gauge his reaction to mine. Obviously he was stressed and I wasn't helping. Oh no. No. I spoke softly as my feet started backing away from him. Various scenarios started running through my mind, and feet were taking me away before I could register what was going on. Before he could grab me again, I was running. I listened as he struggled to get out of the sand to come after me. I half cried the same sentence another dozen times before he caught up. We were both on the pavement now, my pace refusing to slow down. Of course that didn't bother him. He matched my sprint with ease. As we were running I could tell he was trying to say something, but I wasn't listening. It's not that I didn't want to, but my ears had stopped working. The last word he had spoken rang through my mind, bouncing between each ear until I was sure I wouldn't hear anything ever again. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not now. My wrist suddenly caught on something, and I realized it was his hand. He dragged it behind me, forcing me to stop running. When he twisted my arm so I would face him, I found that I suddenly had countless questions racing through my mind. You've obviously heard of mates then, he mused, breathless, when we came face to face. Why are you asking me? The first question left my lips. He shrugged, though I could tell it was a forced movement. Just a hunch. He carefully studied my face as his words left his mouth. My entire body tensed. I somehow knew he was going to say something like that, but that did nothing to help my panic. My breathing was now coming out forced and erratic, sweat slowly forming on the back of my neck. When he saw my frame he tensed a bit more. A hunch. Are you sure? I breathed out. He looked startled by my question, but as the shock melted away he gave a half smile, almost laughing. Yeah, I'm sure. I tried to pry away my wrist from his hands, desperately wanting to be anywhere else in the world. However, he didn't budge. He didn't speak either, and he looked as if he was waiting for me to say something. Who are you? My second question made itself known. He puffed out his chest slightly before speaking. Samuel Clark, beta of the Crimson Eye Pack. My eyes widened and my word came out as a whisper. No, you can't be him. I knew who he was. He was ruthless. His alpha was insane. Their pack spared nothing when it came to keeping the new order. Of every werewolf never wanted to have a conversation with, he was the first. Who are you? His voice came out almost comical. I looked him up and down, stopping for a second on his dark eyes. They corresponded with the dark color of his hair, and went perfectly with his tanned skin. I stopped my eyes there, shutting them tightly. I refused to believe this was happening. No, I answered his question, though not as he would have liked. I took his surprise at my answer to my advantage and pried my hand away from his grasp. Then I started walking away from him. I wanted to run, but my limbs were growing tired fast. I also knew that Samuel would catch up to me anyway. My feet carried me in an unknown direction as my thoughts wandered. If what Samuel was saying was true, then I was screwed. There was no getting out of this town. He would make sure of that. He caught up to me again, and I could see a smile plastered on his face. He brought his arms out while walking to me. What do you mean no? I mean no and everything that goes along with the word. I couldn't help half crying the sentence. I was in panic mode. Something Samuel clearly enjoyed, judging by his reactions. He brought his arms down and tried to pull on my own. I yanked them away from his grasp and brought them closer to my chest, walking faster. However, this didn't deter him. I know what no means. What I meant was why. What's wrong with you? I stopped at his words. Nothing is wrong with me. I hissed at him and he backed away slightly, but his smile stayed put. And I don't have to tell you why. I tried to start walking again, but Samuel had grabbed my wrist before I could move. Let me go. Not until you tell me why you keep running away and avoiding me. His tone was slightly more serious this time, the smile fading. I glanced at his eyes, which I had been avoiding. They were pure and pleading. We held eye contact for more than a brief moment, and I could feel my unease settle slightly. I realized that if Samuel wanted to hurt me, he would have done it already. Wolves didn't have a problem making a public example of somebody. I sighed as my legs gave out, and I sat down where I was at, in the middle of the sidewalk. Samuel followed suit, sitting so he could face me. I tried to take my wrist back while responding. I said no because I don't want to be someone's mate. I told him half the truth. He kept my wrist captive in his hand, waiting for me to elaborate. I groaned, trying to put my thoughts together. I couldn't tell him what I thought of this new world. I couldn't tell him I was planning on abandoning this town in hopes of escaping werewolves. I couldn't tell him anything. If I did, he'd throw me to his alpha so quick that I wouldn't have time to blink, let alone plead for my life. Samuel spoke again, bringing me out of my thoughts. So, I take it that you don't like us. I wasn't stupid enough to admit to that. No, I started but was cut off. You're lying. Samuel frowned, taking a deep breath through his nose. I was about to object before I remembered his heightened senses. The only werewolf I'd ever been around was my mother's husband, and he was too drunk most of the time to use his nose. I'd always been told of their impeccable senses, but never had I been able to put them to the test. Samuel huffed. Why? I sighed. I debated not answering him, but I knew I wasn't getting anywhere with silence. I just don't have great experiences. Can I go now? I lifted my wrist to his gaze. He didn't let my hand go. Listen, I know this is probably weird for you. I scoffed. That was an understatement. He ignored my jab and quickly continued. But this is actually a good thing. I scoffed again. This isn't a good thing unless you're a werewolf. For humans, it means enslavement and subjection for the rest of their lives. I didn't mean to say the last part out loud, but once I did, there was no going back. I gave a side glance to Samuel, anticipating his reaction. When I looked at him, though, he was quietly letting the gears turn in his mind. If I didn't know any better, I would have thought I saw an ounce of hurt in his eyes. All this did was confuse me further. From what I'd always seen, werewolves didn't get hurt. They got angry. I tried to ignore him and looked out to the ocean again. I was silently begging for the serenity that came with it. From my position atop the cliff, I could see the entire sunset, a normally beautiful view. However, the day was tainted. There was no more beauty, Just a werewolf sitting across from me about to ruin what was left of my life. I shifted in my position, noting the sunset and realizing how late it had gotten. If I didn't get home soon, there would be consequences. However, glancing at Samuel, I didn't know which I'd prefer to face. Samuel suddenly asked me a question, but I didn't hear him. He repeated himself as I tore my gaze away from the horizon to meet his piercing eyes. "What's your name?" "Beth." I quickly told him my mother's name. If he didn't know my name, he couldn't find me. He took a deep breath, no doubt catching my lie. "What's your name?" "Julie." "Seriously?" He brought his eyes to the sky, breathing deeply. "It's not going to kill you to tell me." It was my turn to sigh. This wasn't working. "Samantha," I eventually spoke lowly. "Seriously?" He laughed. "What's wrong with it?" I tried to keep the venom out of my words. I knew why he was laughing, but I wasn't in the mood to humor him. "It's just a funny coincidence, that's all." He half smiled. "What's your last name, Samantha?" "Felton," I told him simply, not bothering to lie. "Samantha Felton." Samuel repeated the name softly, smiling to himself. "Samantha, this has happened completely wrong and I want no need to make up for it. Can I walk you home?" I tensed at his question. I gave another side glance only to find that Samuel was staring intently at me, awaiting my answer like the apocalypse. As far as I could tell, his intentions were sincere, but that didn't quiet any of my aching doubts or fears. The last thing I wanted Samuel to know is where I lived. "Why should I?" Samuel smiled. A full-on ear-to-ear, teeth-showing smile. "Well, for one, I'll let go of your hand." He paused and peeled back his fingers from mine. I was standing in the next instant, ready to bolt. "And two, it's getting late and you don't have your pepper spray." I stopped mid-turn as my hand flinched to my backpack. I closed my eyes and let my head drop, realizing I left it on the beach where Samuel had so kindly thrown it. I weighed my options and what he was telling me but decided to keep walking. After what I'd faced today, I could walk home without pepper spray. And for three, Samuel walked up beside me. "I can show you why I'm not such a bad choice for a mate." His voice was perky, like he had already won the battle. "I'm not your mate." I spat the word. "I'm a human." Samuel raised his hands in defeat. "Fine. I can show you why I'm not a bad choice for a friend." I rolled my eyes. "I clearly know you already have other intentions." "Maybe, but what if we forget about all that? Maybe we can start over." It's kind of hard to start over when one of the first things you say to me is, "I'm your mate." My tone was harsh and unforgiving. I knew I shouldn't be speaking to a werewolf like this, but in this moment I had no control. Avoiding Samuel's gaze, I looked to my right and caught a glance of the horizon. I looked out only to see the sun truly starting to set, bits of it disappearing beneath the ocean. At this sight, a new wave of panic hit. Samuel was still talking, but I wasn't paying attention to him now. I looked down at my watch only to confirm my fears. I was beyond late. I cursed myself and quickly adjusted my backpack before sprinting in the opposite direction of the beach. I had just gotten underway when I was pulled back once again. I looked back to see Samuel holding my backpack by the handle, preventing me from moving further. "Let me go, I have to go." I practically screamed at him. He was alarmed at my sudden shift of emotion but didn't budge. "What's wrong with you?" That was the second time he'd asked me that tonight, and my face flushed with rage. I didn't have time for this. "Nothing is wrong with me. You're the one holding me hostage," I snarled, pulling against his grip and debating leaving my backpack behind. "Well, that's a bit dramatic," he laughed. I stopped struggling for a moment, ignoring his comment. "Look, I have to go. Actually, I had to go 30 minutes ago. But thanks to you," I tried tugging my bag from his grip as I spoke my last sentence. I got distracted. "So why don't you let me walk you home?" I stared at him wide-eyed, abruptly realizing there was no way around this. "You know what, I don't care what you do," I half-shouted, earning a smile from Samuel. "But I have to go. Now." Samuel brought his hands up in surrender, and I once again adjusted my backpack. As soon as it was settled though, my bag was being taken off my back. I looked behind me to see Samuel slipping the straps off my shoulders and putting them on his own. I stared at him, clearly annoyed. "What?" he questioned, a false innocence to his voice. "I just don't want you running off again." I groaned. "We both know you could easily catch up." The statement made me shudder. Samuel ignored my comment, stepping easily into the pace I set. So where is home? Just off Bury Street. My words came out rushed as I quickened my pace. That's not too far. How am I supposed to charm you in such little time? I rolled my eyes. Not sure that's possible with any amount of time. Samuel smiled. So what were you doing at the beach? Taking a break. I tried to ignore him as I focused on my flip-flops slapping against the pavement, pieces of sand flying up to my calves. From what? Life. I breathed in the final scent of salty air as we rounded a corner and the beach slipped from view. There was silence for a few steps and I took pride in how Samuel seemed to fumble for his words. I wasn't giving him much to work with. I was actually getting ready to take a run when I saw you, Samuel told me. I tried to ignore you for a long time. But before I knew it, my feet brought me right to you. Charming. I sneered. Samuel laughed. It was loud and full. Not exactly. But I'll take it. He paused before his next question. Who do you live with? My mother and her husband. I wanted to lie, but there was no point. Wouldn't your mother's husband be your father? I breathed deeply. We were already talking about things I didn't want to mention. He's my stepfather. Then why don't you refer to him as that? I glanced towards Samuel. This man was incessant. Do you not know what boundaries are? His step faltered, but I didn't wait for him to retort, spitting my next words. Because he's not my father. Samuel nodded, though I'm sure he didn't understand. The family was sacred to his kind and they had no concepts of hatred for one another. I was sure of it. He continued our one-sided conversation. I've been here for 3 years now. I used to live up north, but Riley requested I come down here and help him with the pack. Riley, as in Riley Matthews the Elf. I know who Riley Matthews is. I tried not to spit the name. Samuel laughed. Well, somebody doesn't like him. I never said that. You didn't have to. He laughed again. Riley is an acquired taste. We've been best friends since we were kids. He's always been like a brother to me. Great, I muttered to myself. It registered after I said it that Samuel would probably hear me. I looked over and he was frowning. I knew it was disrespectful to talk about an alpha like that, but I couldn't help myself. Not when it came to Riley. We had just rounded another corner when I saw the lights flash on in front of my house. Both my family's cars were parked out front, which meant that James, my stepfather, was home. I stopped suddenly and glanced over to Samuel, who had stopped as well. I can take it from here. I was suddenly uncomfortable but tried not to let it show. I reached for my backpack and Samuel gave it to me, though unwillingly. Samuel brought his eyebrows together, glancing around. As he was doing this, a figure burst through my house's front door and stumbled down the steps. I could tell the figure was my stepfather, but I wasn't going to tell him that. Samuel was not going to meet or ever know about him. Thanks for the talk. I turned to walk away, silently pleading that Samuel didn't follow me. When I snuck a glance backward, I saw that he was still rooted in place. He was a lot stiffer than before, and I could see his muscles tensing. I turned and tried to forget the past hour as I continued walking, my figure eventually coming into the light of my house. When this happened, my stepfather's drunken voice met my ears. Sam, he hiccuped in the middle of my name, making it into 2 syllables. Yes, sir. I glanced back to where Samuel was standing but thankfully found him nowhere in sight. I'm sorry I'm late. I got caught up at work. The trash can he'd been leaning on toppled over, sending garbage cascading down the driveway just as I started walking up. James laughed. Look, it's garbage just like you. My frame was tense and body alert, but I rolled my eyes and bent down to start cleaning it up. I realized too late that he saw my expression. The blow to my head came unexpectedly this time, and I wasn't braced or ready to handle it. I fell back on my back, hands flying to my head. Don't you roll your eyes at me. His drunken voice met my ears, and I knew he was getting ready to strike again. Once was never enough. I'm sorry, sir. Please forgive me. It won't happen again. I scooted up until I was on my knees and bowed my head, pleading. I watched James approach me from underneath my hair, preparing for another blow. I braced my body, preparing for the worst. James, honey. My mother's voice met my ears and he stopped. What do you want, Beth? He hollered back towards the house. I could see my mother standing in the doorway, her frame casting shadows across the yard. Honey, your dinner is ready. Her voice cooed across the yard, pulling James back into her falsely loving arms. I let out a breath of relief as James started walking back towards the house, grumbling along the way. It was only when he was inside the house with the door shut that I let myself relax. In that moment I realized I was shaking. I tried to calm my nerves and trembling hands but eventually gave up. Instead, I fell to the side of my knees and brought my hand gingerly to my temple, testing the surface for blood. Luckily there was no broken skin, and he'd hit me where my hair fell, so no one would notice the bruise. I sighed heavily before I turned and started gathering the garbage around me again. As I was pushing rotten food back into the black plastic bags, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I looked back into the trees that lined the other side of my street, watching carefully for the source of the noise. I almost turned back around before I saw a figure walk out from behind the branches. The night had hidden his frame at first, but as he stepped into the light I realized who it was. "Samuel," I whispered harshly, looking back towards the house. "What are you still doing here?" He was now kneeling beside me, helping shove things back into the garbage sacks. I knew something was off and I had to see what it was. I stared incredulously at his tense frame. My face contorted into a deep scowl as I spat. "Well, are you happy you got a show?" His voice darkened. "No." I stopped moving at his change in tone, alarmed at how sinister he suddenly sounded. My glare was wiped from my face and the only emotion I could suddenly feel was fear. I only started moving again when I realized the garbage was gone, and I was still kneeling on the gravel. I went to pick up a large sack and place it back in the bin, but a hand caught my wrist. I whirled back to see Samuel with his head bent and torso turned towards the street. "I need you to come with me." "What?" I whispered, alarmed. "I don't want you staying here," he told me simply. His voice was still dark and his head still bent. I glanced towards the house again, praying James didn't come back outside. As I spoke I shifted on my feet. "It doesn't matter what you want. This is where I live." I pulled my hand away from his, only getting a release due to his surprise. I took that moment to quickly gather the other bags and throw them away, before running to my front door. "Samantha!" He practically growled my name and reached for my wrist again. I dodged his hand, anticipating the move. "He's going to hear you," I hissed as I moved further away. "Please just go home." I didn't wait for his response before I turned my back to him and walked through my front door. Chapter 3. The window. I was sitting in my room now, waiting for exhaustion to overcome me. I had gotten away lucky tonight, as James ignored me for the rest of the evening. My mother knew how to distract him, and this wasn't the first time she'd saved me from his drunken wrath. I swung the window to my bedroom open wide, glancing out into the night. The rain had finally stopped and left a cool breeze in its wake. I inhaled the scent of wet plants and fresh water, letting the smells calm me. The cushions on my windowsill seat gathered around me as I sank further into them, bringing my knees to my chest. A lot had happened today. A lot that I didn't want to think about. At the beginning of the day, the only focus on my mind was to get through the week without pissing off James. Now I had to figure out how to disappear under the watchful glare of two werewolves. I had no idea what was beyond this town or life. I'd only ever known this life and these creatures. My mother used to tell me about what it was like before them. We were happy. But it all changed when the wolves took over, and again when James came along. She used to speak of those times a lot more, until James caught her reminiscing one night. After that, the subject was forbidden. My thoughts were interrupted when something shuffled outside my window. I quickly lifted my head up to find the source of the noise. Before I could search, I was staring into dark eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. I, of course, knew these eyes belonged to the last person I wanted to see, Samuel. I nearly screamed as his face appeared inside my windowsill, my lamp illuminating his features. I brought my hands to my mouth to muffle my cries, losing my balance at the sudden movement. I fell silently to the floor, landing awkwardly on my hip. Once I gained my composure, I heard Samuel start to chuckle. I sent silent daggers into his eyes, letting him know how unpleased I was in his presence. Whoa, calm down, Tiger." He laughed again. "What are you doing here?" I less than whispered, considering James was just outside in the living room. Samuel's voice got serious. "I told you I wanted you to come with me." I stared at him. Clearly this man was insane. "You can't be serious." "I'm not going anywhere with you. I have to work tomorrow and I was about to go to sleep." I got off my position from the floor and went to close the windows. "Leave me alone." He caught my hands just as I was about to shut the window in his face. I pushed with all my might against him, but he easily forced the windows back open. "You don't tell me what to do, Samantha. Sorry, that's not how this works." His grip was still on my hand on the window, and he was refusing to let go. "Now, you can either come willingly or forced. It's your choice. Are you insane?" I hissed, glancing back towards the door. "God, all you wolves are the same. You can't just take me from my room in the middle of the night. I haven't even known you for a full day and here you come, expecting me to heed your every command. You're delusional if you think I'm coming with you." He caught me off. "Watch yourself." I didn't respond but continued my fuming in silence. I made no move to go with him, and he made no move to let go of me. I debated calling for my mother, but I didn't want her to know about Samuel, or get in trouble with James. Samuel must have noticed me looking back because he growled lowly. I'd heard that kind of noise from James on more than one occasion and didn't want to see what came after it. "Please," I started. "I'm fine. I'm going to sleep. James will be pissed if I'm not here in the morning. Going with you is only going to make things worse for me." "I don't see how that's true. If you're not near him, he can't hurt you." Samuel shot back at me. I flinched at his words. "I can't just leave my mother here alone with him. I don't care about your mother right now. I care about you." Samuel suddenly started pulling me towards him, across the window opening. "No. Stop." I struggled with every ounce of my being, but I wasn't a match for him. Fear flashed through my body and my feet suddenly started flying, my hands losing grip on the window. Samuel had anticipated this, however, and caught me easily in his arms. By the time my feet were on the ground, I was outside in the bushes standing on top of Samuel's feet. I tried backing away from him, but his arms were snaked around my waist, holding me hostage. Fear was fully coursing through me now. My breathing was heavy and ragged, my heart beating out of my chest. I tried to remember the self-defense I had learned and blindly shot my knee upwards. My joint hit him right in between his legs, and his grip loosened on me. I quickly shot out of his arms and started to run. I wouldn't have had enough time to get back inside my window, and running was the next best option. Even though he was easily faster than me, I had to try. I didn't look back to see if he was following, but I was sure he wouldn't just let me go. I quickly ran across the street and darted into the first line of trees that I could see, disappearing into their leaves. I tried to listen to someone behind me and dared to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, Samuel was barreling towards me at an inhuman speed. I desperately pushed my body to go faster and willed myself not to trip over leaves and stumps. I knew it was my only option, so I searched desperately for a place to hide. There was plenty of trees to climb or bushes to crawl in, but I was afraid that would take too much time. However, realizing that was my only option, I quickly slipped into a piece of a large brush. I crashed into the leaves, feeling the thorns pull at my clothing and hair. After the initial impact, I didn't dare make any movements. I heard his feet running up behind me not too soon after, but they suddenly stopped. I figured he'd realized I wasn't ahead of him anymore. I tried to listen over the sound of my heartbeat, when I sensed his footsteps drawing closer to me. "Really, Samantha? Did you forget that I'm a wolf?" His face suddenly appeared directly in front of mine. His body crouched down beside the bush. I let out a scream, but he quickly brought his large hands to my face to silence me. As he dragged me out of the leaves, I fought harder than I ever had in my life. I thrashed my limbs wildly, kicking and punching whatever I could contact. I didn't stop there but bit at the skin that was holding my mouth as well. My movements did nothing to thwart Samuel, however, and before too long I was being thrown over his shoulder. "Let me down," I cried loudly, not bothering to silence my voice. "Keep it down or I am going to have to make you be quiet." His voice was rougher than before, more hostile. It sent chills down my spine. I quieted my voice but still pleaded with him. "Please, Samuel, I just want to go home. Please, I'll be fine, just put me down. I don't want to go with you." Samuel adjusted me on his shoulder, knocking the breath from my lungs. "It doesn't really matter what you want." Chapter for the woods. Despite my constant slur of protests and curse words, Samuel continued walking through the forest, away from my house. I was still slung over his shoulder, and my fists were getting sore from constantly clubbing his back. However, he acted as if I was more of a small puppy than a full-sized human being. He had no problem carrying my flailing body over tree stumps, leaves, and ditches. With each step he took, I grew more desperate. I didn't know if I would see my home again. I didn't know if I would see my mother or brother again. And most importantly, I didn't know what James would do to them when he realized I was gone. I could tell Samuel was becoming more and more frustrated. His grip was unbearably tight, and his shoulders were tense. His breathing was heavy, but I guessed it wasn't from the exertion of carrying me. After a particularly hard blow to his neck, he suddenly released his hold on me. I fell from atop his shoulder, twisting in the air. My hands reached out to ease the fall, but they did no good. A sickening crack sounded as I made an impact with the dirt. I cried out in pain, my body collapsing on top of my wrist. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked me awkwardly. He was still standing where he dropped me. I glared at him while standing up. "No, I'm not. Look, I'm sorry," he started. I wasn't surprised to hear him practically growling at me. "I just couldn't stand the thought of leaving you there. I don't want you to get hurt. If you weren't being so difficult, I wouldn't have dropped you." Vicious retorts sounded through my mind, but I held them back. I couldn't exactly tell a werewolf they were a dense, careless, sadistic, controlling moron. "I don't want to fight with you, but I can't take you home if you're acting like a child." My ears perked up, ignoring his insult. "Home? My home?" I froze. The fire inside my bones suddenly turned to fear. He noticed my new expression, but it only enraged him more. "Why the hell are you so terrified of coming with me?" he roared, his voice sending sleeping birds flying through the trees. "Are you serious?" I started, my voice rising to match his. "You just practically kidnapped me, and you're wondering why I don't want to go home with you. You're incredible." I threw my hands in the air, wincing slightly when the movement hit my wrist. "I'm just trying to protect you." "Thanks, but I've managed just fine on my own." "Obviously you haven't. It doesn't seem like your life is exactly a paradise." "No, it's not." I paused, my anger finally getting the better of me. "But at least at my house I don't have to deal with a dense, careless, sadistic, controlling pack of moronic werewolves. So much for not voicing that thought." Samuel was suddenly silent. Not only was he silent, but he was still. If he wasn't standing and breathing erratically, I would have thought him dead. His head lowered, but from my height, I was still able to see his expression. His eyes were no longer dark. Now they resembled a ruby, bright red and dangerous. I lowered my gaze slightly, though still fuming. I had enough common sense to know not to mess with a werewolf when their eyes changed. James' eyes had done that on one occasion, and it was a disaster. However, his yellow slits were put to shame by Samuel's burning orbs. He suddenly broke the silence, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I will not have you speak about my pack like that. You may be my mate, and I may be patient with you insulting me, but you will respect them. I'm not your mate." His hands clenched, making and releasing a fist multiple times. I knew I was pushing him. "Just because you're a human now doesn't mean we'll be one forever. You are my mate." I didn't respond. I was done speaking, and I definitely wasn't going to acknowledge what he just insinuated. Instead, I huffed and let my legs give out, my body falling to the ground in a heap. My wrist was cradled against my chest, and I stared straight at the ground. I couldn't see much in the dark, but I tried to focus on anything but Samuel. Tears started to suddenly sting my eyes, but I blinked furiously to hold them at bay. In the end, they still fell. "Why are you crying?" His voice was a demand, not a question. I rolled my eyes. "Because I can't stand you," I spat. He didn't respond, but I heard him move his feet away from me. By the time I looked up, he was out of my sight. I still heard twigs breaking and bushes being torn aside, but the sounds were getting farther and farther away. I hesitated, not knowing what to do. Looking around, I realized I had absolutely no idea where I was. I never walked through the woods for obvious reasons. But now I was beginning to regret my cowardice, because I was sitting alone in the dirt in the middle of the night, with a deranged wolfman on the loose. I peered to where Samuel had disappeared, half expecting him to come back and kill me. After all, I had insulted and rejected him and his precious pack. Still, I wasn't going to sit and wait around for something bad to happen. I lifted myself carefully off the ground, not moving my wrist from its position on my chest. I was still crying, but the tears were falling slowly, almost mockingly. I turned around and began to walk in the direction opposite that Samuel had gone. I lifted my legs up higher than normal, in order to avoid any uprooted trees I couldn't see. I knew I was making a lot of noise, but I didn't care. Samuel would have been able to sniff me out anyway. Our conversation reverberated through my ears, and I thought of all the things I could have said to him. I was muttering to myself, curses flying word after word. The night was cold, however, and my mumbling soon died down. I focused instead on wrapping my nightshirt closer to my body and trying to find a clearing of trees. I knew summer was ending by the way the nights had started to get colder. Normally this didn't bother me because at night I was usually laying in bed, tucked underneath a thick duvet. If I ever made it home, I didn't think I'd wear shorts to bed again. I wasn't necessarily shivering as I walked, but goosebumps were starting to rise. I hadn't noticed the cold earlier because of my adrenaline taking over, but it was starting to subside. With it, so did my courage. It was slowly dawning on me how much trouble I was in. Not only the trouble of the moment, but in the days to come. If I did make it home, I was sure that James would have found me missing by now. That meant he would have thought I sneaked out. I flinched as I realized what a gruesome punishment that would be. On the other hand, if Samuel really did take me to his home, I was done for. No more family, no more freedom. Depending on his pack, maybe even no more humanity. I stopped walking as that thought passed my mind. A werewolf wasn't supposed to have a human as a mate. Still, it happened. When it did happen, many packs preferred the human be turned. When they weren't, they were practically exiled. My mother and James were the perfect examples. James had met my mother, wooed her with his fake charm, then attempted to turn her. When he found out she had kids though, he didn't turn her. He realized only after he claimed her that us kids would have to be turned as well. This meant he would have sole responsibility for us, which he had no intention of taking on. So, he chose the exile choice and we were stuck with him. Alone. My mother was never able to leave James, but not because she loved him back. She may have been his mate, but he wasn't hers. Humans don't mate like the wolves do. The only reason she'd stayed with him was that he constantly threatened to kill her. She'd always told me to do better than her. And I'd always promised her I would. It seemed that promise was going to be in vain. I stared around at my surroundings once again. Not much time had passed and I guessed I hadn't gotten very far. Plus my wrist was aching more than ever. I cursed Samuel for bringing me into this situation. But I was beginning to realize he may be my only way out. This forest was large. Large enough that I could walk for a few days and still be lost. It had happened to too many hiking tourists. I knew that the trees wrapped around the cliffs next to the beach, but other than that I didn't know much about the area I was in. I mused over my options. I could wait here until morning and then resume my journey, or I could ask Samuel for help. I knew he was still lurking somewhere beyond the trees. Wolves never let their prey wander far. As if in answer to my thought, I heard something crack behind me. I whirled around, realizing that asking Samuel for anything was not an option. I was about to tell him off when my eyes rested on the source of the noise. I stopped dead in my tracks. Stopped breathing, thinking, moving, blinking. I was staring into the red eyes of a wolf. I couldn't tell what color its fur was in the darkness, but that didn't matter. The wolf was growling lightly, though no teeth were bared. I watched in horror as it approached me, my feet suddenly glued to the ground. The wolf's movements were slow and calculated, and he was staring straight back into my eyes. His body was equal to my height. The wolf continued walking until he was about a foot ahead of me. I braced myself, knowing what was about to come. Chapter 5. The woods continued. I waited and waited, but the wolf never lunged. Instead, he stayed in place, a foot away from me. We both stood in our position, frozen, for a few agonizing minutes. I didn't dare move, speak, or even breathe. I didn't know what kind of wolf Samuel was. Obviously, he had some sort of thinking ability, but that didn't do much to calm my nerves. Thinking could easily be overpowered by instinct. The instinct to kill. Or at the very least, maim to weaken his prey. When I didn't move, the wolf eventually relaxed, sensing that I was no immediate threat. He sat back on his legs but still stared intently at me. I couldn't help but think he was waiting for something. Okay, I breathed out slowly, testing the waters. Nothing was going to change until I said something. Still, I spoke slowly, almost as if to a child. Obviously you're angry. I'm pissed too. But we don't need to do anything we're going to regret. I was speaking more about his actions than my own. At my words, the wolf stiffened. A breath caught in my throat. I waited in suspense for him to assert his dominance. I'd heard the stories and seen James in action. If a werewolf was threatened, they wouldn't hesitate to show you what you were up against. However, to my surprise, he stayed in the same rigid position. My instincts were taking over as well, and before I knew it, my body was shifting to a less threatening position. I brought my hands slowly up, palms facing him. I then mimicked the wolf's earlier movements and knelt on the ground, my hands still raised. Finally and begrudgingly, I lowered my gaze. Once I was beneath his line of vision, he seemed satisfied. His shoulders moved out to the side slightly, as he adjusted his stance. He was still towering over me and made no move to change that. We both stood still and quiet for a few more moments before I finally broke it once again. Samuel, I don't know what you want me to do, I finally sighed in defeat. The wolf's head cocked to the side where it paused. He blinked a few times before shifting his weight to all four legs, standing up. He slowly stepped towards me, and my heart started pounding in my chest. Even though he didn't seem angry or out of control, I was petrified because I was, well, helpless. Once at my side, the animal brought one of his front paws to the air beside him. I tried to decode the meaning of the gesture, but the wolf grew impatient. He raised his paw again, but this time connected it to my arm, dragging it lightly down to the ground. My body followed the paw's movement, falling gently to the side. My legs were now stretched out in front of me, my arms folded lightly in my chest. I leaned up against a tree, letting my back rest on its trunk. From an onlooker's point of view, I was at ease in this position. The wolf seemed satisfied. He came and laid down next to the tree, letting out a large breath of air. As I listened, I could tell his breathing was even and heavy. I snuck a glance at Samuel, noticing his eyes were closed. Okay, we're sitting down. Great. Are we staying here all night? Slight bitterness crept into my voice. Samuel opened an eye, watching me. This isn't exactly paradise. I mocked his earlier phrase. He snorted and the atmosphere lightened considerably. I was beginning to realize he wasn't angry, but I couldn't tell what he was feeling. I fidgeted with my fingers, only realizing after I did so that my wrist was still hurting. Bringing it up to my line of vision, I tried to see the details of my skin. It was difficult, considering the only light I had was the moon shining through the trees. Eventually, I found that there was a larger than normal bump on my wrist bone, and I figured that was where the bone had cracked. I touched it gingerly just to be sure and sucked in a breath when the shooting pain hit. Samuel moved next to me, opening both of his eyes. He was watching me as I fiddled with my hand. I noticed his glance and put my arm back down, smiling slightly in his direction. At his glimpse, it suddenly hit me that now was the perfect time for me to voice my thoughts without him interjecting his own. It's no problem. Just a sprain, I think. But I hesitated, considering the outcome of what I would say. Could potentially be disastrous. I can fix it up, no problem, back at my house. The wolf stiffened and his eyes bore into mine. I stared back. But instead of growling at the challenge, Samuel whimpered. I was caught off guard by the sound and shifted uncomfortably. If you take me back home, I have an old brace I could put on. I'll be good as new. It won't hurt anymore. The wolf was stiff as a board now, and I realized that my propositions weren't going over well. So, I used my last negotiating option. You can stay there with me if you want. Make sure nothing happens. He didn't respond immediately, so I waited in silence. Never-ending, tortuous silence. Samuel stayed still, but we had long ago broken eye contact. Now all I had to go off of was his breathing, and that wasn't telling me much. It was heavy and even, yet barely there. Like he didn't want me to know he was breathing. It was a slow process, but he finally started moving again. Limb by limb, he was tensing and stretching his muscles. Eventually, he moved until his legs were fully extended. He lifted himself up at this point, coming to a standing position. I watched him carefully and obeyed when he gestured for me to stand as well. We stared at each other for a few moments more until he turned around and started stalking away from me. I stumbled after him, putting my good arm forward to lean against the trees as I went. Does that mean yes? Are you taking me back to my house? I couldn't help but notice how desperate I sounded. Samuel paused his trudging, glancing backward. He hung his head, but I noticed him give a slight nod. My heart leaped. I let out the smallest gasp, almost too quiet for my own ears. However, Samuel heard it, and I could have sworn I saw him roll his eyes. I didn't care though. I was going home. I would just have to figure out how to get rid of him once I got there. Chapter 6. The bedroom. The walk back to my house was quick. We hadn't gotten as far as I thought and I was fuming. But I was mostly angry at myself. If I would have just sucked up the cold and dark night, maybe I would have made it home on my own. Then I wouldn't have to deal with what was sure to come. We were both standing at the edge of the woods, staring back at my house. Samuel was waiting for me to make the first move. But I couldn't. The only thing I could think about was what was going to happen when I crawled back in through my window. Samuel was growing impatient, but he was trying not to let it show. He wasn't pacing, but he raised and lowered his paws countless times whilst flicking his tail. I'm going to need you to hang back for just a minute. I half glanced at Samuel, rushing to finish my sentence when he froze. Just until I can get back inside. Then you're welcome to stay all night. Promise. I knew there was no getting rid of him. When Samuel still didn't move, I tried another tactic. It might be better for me if you didn't, if you could. I gestured to his wolf body, hoping Samuel caught what I was trying to say. When he looked at me with confused eyes, I didn't spare kind words. I was growing impatient too. James won't be as pissed or threatened if he doesn't see another werewolf trying to sneak into his house. We don't want James mad because if he is, then he will take it out on my mom. He's not stupid enough to do anything to me if he sees you, so he'll do the next best thing. Please, if you want to make this easier, just please go back to being human. I finished my desperate ramblings out of breath. I prayed that Samuel would listen to me. If he didn't, I was sure there would be an equivalent of a bloodbath in my bedroom. Samuel suddenly stood up and moved back into the trees. I stood still, listening for the signs of what he was doing. Silent minutes passed by, and just as I was about to give up on him, Samuel's voice met my ears. I need clothes. I stammered something unintelligible as I searched for something to hand him. I scanned my body trying to decide if I could spare an article of clothing. However, I was only in a t-shirt and shorts. I don't exactly have anything, I stuttered. I heard him sigh heavily. Look, I'm trying here. Really trying to let you play this out. But this is a bad idea. I don't even know why I'm listening to you, to be honest. I ignored him. Where are your clothes from before? Torn. Gone. I wasn't exactly planning on turning tonight, so I didn't bring any extra with me. I noticed his voice was growing tired. I eyed my house again, debating my options. I can go and get you something from my house. He didn't dismiss my suggestion but huffed in annoyance. Like I said, this is a bad idea. If either of us were smart, we'd be halfway to my house by now. I scowled slightly, noting he couldn't see my expression. I'm going to get you clothes from my room. I started to walk forward, but I heard frantic shuffling behind me. I didn't dare turn around when he spoke, noticing his voice was closer than before. I wasn't in the mood to face a naked man. No, he hesitated. You know what, this was a mistake. We're done. Let's go. I felt him close the distance between us, but I quickly jumped forward. No. I hissed in his direction. Look, here's what we will do. Let's just walk to my house and I will climb in the window and get you some pants. You can just follow behind me. I heard Samuel groan and call my name, but I was already walking. I didn't have to listen for his footsteps to know he was coming after me. Whether to follow my plan or take me back, I didn't yet know. And I wasn't going to sit still to find out. By the time I reached my window, my heart was pounding. I shuffled silently through the bushes, placing my hands on the ledge to lift myself up. Before I did though, I peered into my room. The white walls and carpet seemed untouched. The only thing out of place was a yellow pillow on the ground. Everything seemed to be the same from when I left earlier. I let a glimmer of hope fill my chest. Maybe James had been too drunk to notice my absence. It wasn't easy lifting myself back up into my room. At least it wasn't easy to do quietly. I couldn't help the thud that sounded when I fell onto my floor. At the noise, I held my breath and fixed my gaze on my bedroom door. There was no commotion beyond it though, so I chanced standing. I knew Samuel was waiting by my window, no doubt growing impatient. I quickly ran to my closet, fishing out the biggest pair of pants I owned. In the end, I found gray sweats that belonged to my brother. I hesitated when I picked them up, not wanting Samuel to ruin a memory. However, movement outside my bedroom door quickly threw my hesitations away. I dashed to the window and threw the pants out just before my door was opened. My mother peeked her head inside, brown hair falling through the door frame. "Samantha." I let out a sigh of relief. "Yeah, it's me," I mimicked her whispers. She smiled and came into my room, walking carefully. Floors were known to creak around here. She walked slowly to my bed and sat down, motioning for me to sit next to her. "Where were you?" I had to keep James distracted all night. As I sat next to her, I bowed my head in guilt. I knew how she kept him occupied. "I'm so sorry, Mom. Are you all right?" I studied her small frame. There weren't any fresh bruises lining her freckles, nor any blood falling from her limbs. However, her clothing was torn in various places, pale skin showing through the fabric. She smiled weakly. "Of course. But you didn't answer me. Where were you?" I fidgeted with my hands, forgetting the broken bone in my wrist. I tried not to let it show when the pain shot up my arm. Well, I realized I couldn't answer her question. My eyes darted to the window where I knew Samuel was listening. Any minute and he would probably come barging into the room. At that thought, I quickly came up with a response. "I just went for a walk." My mother's eyes narrowed and it was my turn to smile weakly. What I said hadn't been a lie, but it wasn't the full truth. She knew that. "Samantha, you know what would have happened if he found you weren't here." I sighed. "I know. I'm sorry." I let my hair fall over my face as I glared towards my window. "The doctor's called today." My mother's voice quieted considerably. The sentence sent me into shock. I forgot my anger and looked towards my mother, panicked. She noticed my expression and quickly continued. "Don't worry, Will is fine." Something in her voice made me question if that was actually true. "But," I prodded, worried for my brother. "Well, they talked to James, so I didn't get everything. But from what I gathered, they need to do another surgery." I thought the last one fixed everything. My voice heightened. "I guess not. I can try and get the details from James tomorrow, but that's all I know." Silence fell between us. Panic was now coursing through my veins. My brain nagged and reminded me that Samuel was still outside listening, but I didn't care. I hesitated before asking my next question, opening and closing my mouth countless times. But I had to know. My mom noticed my unease and put her hand on mine. I looked down to hide the hurt from my wrist, the gasp of pain becoming my question. "How are we going to afford this one?" Her eyes darkened. Since humans were no longer in charge, things were done differently. If you were in a pack, a doctor was always provided and it was completely free. If you had no werewolf ties, you brought food and supplies to whoever helped you as a recompense for their work. My mother had told me we used to use money, but it was gone now. Useless, the wolves told us. Since we fell into neither of those categories, we had to get creative. We still paid the doctors in the hospital, but we had to do more. Most people wouldn't even look at you if you were exiled, so we had to pay extra for any care. We'd been doing this for months with my brother, and it was beginning to wear on us. We weren't wealthy in the first place, and by now we were practically run dry. "I don't know, Han. I can ask James." "No," I cut her off quickly. "He didn't like to sacrifice for us, and he'd make sure we paid him back how he saw fit." "No. You know what, you can have this. It should be enough." I got off the bed and walked once again to my closet. I lifted a sack out of the corner where it laid, hidden. My mother saw the sack, knowing what it was before I could tell her. "Honey, no. You need that." I looked back to see her shaking her head vigorously. I sighed, pulling out the heavy sack with my good hand. It held countless items to live off of for a few weeks. Clothes, toiletries, non-perishable food. Even some sweets my boss had rewarded me with a few weeks back. I'd been saving this sack, building up my supplies until I could finally leave. Ignoring her protests, I pulled the items into the middle of my floor, handing her the strings. She stared dumbfounded at everything I had acquired. She had no idea I'd saved so much. For fear of having to lie to James, she never asked me about my plans of escape. If this can help Will, then there's no question in using it. I will find another way. As I spoke, I again sat next to her on my bed. At this point, her dark blue eyes were bright with tears. I wrapped my arm around her waist and snuggled into her side, trying to provide comfort. However, it was short-lived. We both suddenly heard a noise sound just beyond my door. Broken and stuttered words met our ears, clearly the drunken language of James. "Oh, I thought he was out for the night. I'm sorry, honey." My mother quickly rose from my bed and half jogged out of my room. She didn't spare a glance back at me, knowing that she had a limited amount of time to get to James before he became conscious again. I was listening to her sweet voice coo over James when a creak at my window brought me back to reality. I watched, slightly amused, as Samuel tried to gracefully pull himself through the opening. Though he didn't fall inside like I had, his legs were bent at weird angles to support his body. Before I could catch his eye, he was staring at the sack beneath my feet. "You're not supposed to hoard supplies, Samantha." I stared at him appalled. With every sentence, he reaffirmed my hatred for his kind. "That's what you gathered from that conversation." "Well, no," he stuttered over his words. "Forget it," I snapped. I stood up, picking up the sack as I did so. I dragged it back to its place inside my closet, shutting the door with a satisfying thud. My good hand was resting on the handle, taking a breather before I had to face Samuel again. "Whose will?" he asked me. I was grateful he'd whispered, but I wasn't in the mood to speak to him. I rested my forehead on the wood above my hand. "My brother." Before he could respond, I turned away from my closet and him and walked to my small nightstand. It was white and yellow, decorated with various pink and purple butterflies. I'd had the thing since I was a little girl. The wood was starting to deteriorate from years of use, but it held up pretty nicely. Absent-mindedly, I dug through the various drawers until I pulled out a brace for my wrist. I'd used it often. James loved to drag me around the house. Once I had it slipped over my skin, I slowly turned to face Samuel. He was still standing by the window, clearly not knowing what to do with himself. I studied his features, getting a good look at him for the first time. His skin was tan and dark, much darker than mine. He had black hair that was cut short but left longer in the front. His face was broad, much like his body, and his nose was wide set. Scruff lined his jaw, accentuating the square features. I couldn't help but realize how handsome he was. Maybe not in the model way, but in the raw and human way. Not that he was anywhere close to human. Before he could notice me staring, I turned away. "So what are you going to do now?" I sat on my bed, studying the carpet intently. Samuel was thrown off by my question, but he tried not to show it. He sat down on my window seat, staring at me. "Well, a shirt would be nice." "I don't exactly have anything that would fit you." "Fair enough," he mused. "Then how about some questions?" "Questions?" I grimaced. "I just wanted to sleep." "Questions? For instance, why are you hoarding all that stuff?" He stood up and made a move to come and sit next to me. When he reached the bed, however, I moved to the floor and leaned against my wall. He sighed but still sat on the mattress. I noted how he made my twin bed look like it belonged to a toddler. I considered my answer. I could tell him my plan, but it was obvious he'd only stop me from going. I knew I couldn't lie to him, so I did the next best thing. "I don't want to answer that question." Samuel sighed. I knew he was tired too. "Okay, fine. What happened to your brother?" Not answering that either. I was being impudent and childish, but I didn't care. "Why not?" Samuel practically growled. "Because I just met you and I'm not going to tell you my life story." Tension settled in the room like a wave crashing onto land. But it wasn't relaxing, calm, or beautiful. This wave was loud, wild, and dangerous. "You know, you're extremely stubborn." Samuel spat at me. "So I've been told." He suddenly sprung up from his position on my bed and began to pace my small room. It took him barely 2 strides to cross the room entirely. As I was watching him, my eyes fell onto my alarm clock that sat on my nightstand. It was late. Much too late. I sighed in defeat. This was a battle that could be fought when I didn't have to wake up early to work. "Look, it's late. I need to sleep." Samuel stopped pacing, watching me. "Fine." I stood up and went to my bed, pulling off a spare blanket before laying it out on the floor. I didn't particularly care if he was comfortable, but I wanted to make it clear he wasn't sleeping in my bed. As I was slipping off my socks, I heard cracking behind me. I turned around just in time to see Samuel disappear and a wolf emerge from his body. It was a harrowing sight, to say the least. I stood in shock for a few moments before I could pull myself together. In the light of my room, I could see the full details of his wolf form. His coloring was a light blonde, almost white. Spots of caramel dance along his back and up to his head. Both of his ears had the caramel color as well. Great. He's a wolf again, I spoke to myself, turning away. As I did so, I noticed the gray sweats he'd been wearing had been folded and were now sitting on the windowsill. Smiling slightly, I turned off the light and crawled into bed. Samuel was curled up on the blanket I'd laid out for him, clearly content. As I settled into my bed, I listened to his foreign breathing, knowing it was going to be a long night. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.